You think he didn't see that the other parties would drop out?
I think he probably needs a few more grown-ups in the room, someone who might say, do you know what do we do if this happens? I think they all felt like this is going to be great, it's going to be the showdown with the establishment that we want. I understand why they did it. I just don't think they thought about, well, what happens if all of the other parties stand aside? I don't think that was sufficiently war-gamed.
We faced a lot of dramatic by-elections this year, and on August the 6th there's going to be another one called by Nigel Farage, who resigned as the MP for Clacton, thereby triggering a by-election which he will fight, in which he says he wants to send a message to the establishment and elites by winning. He believes that he is being persecuted with revelations about donations and in parliamentary investigations into him. Well, this, in fact, will be the 9th Westminster parliamentary by-election fought by Nigel Farage in the course of a long career. He's only won once before. That was, of course, last time in 2024. But his success with UKIP came largely in the European Parliament. So we thought we'd look a little bit about Nigel Farage's electoral history with Nick Tyrone, who is the author of the upcoming book, The Rise of Reform, The Inside Story of Britain's Political Disruptors. Hello to you, Nick.
Hello.
Should be said, Nigel Farage certainly has an appetite for fighting elections, not always with the greatest success.
Indeed. Well, actually, one of the things that I suppose there's many things I disagree with Nigel Farage on, have disagreed with him over the years. I mean, the most obvious one being Brexit. I remain a Remainer. But I have actually always sort of admired about him his dogged determinism. I mean, clearly he felt like getting into Parliament was something that he absolutely had to do. I mean, spoiler alert, he lost 7 of them in a row. 5 general elections and 2 by-elections, I believe. And to keep going after all of that is, I mean, whatever you think of Farage more generally, I think that's actually, there's an admirable quality in that.
Yeah, well, I think his first effort was in Eastleigh. This is a parliamentary by-election in 2013. Here he is talking to Cathy Newman on Channel 4 News.
You talk about success there. Last time you won just 952 votes. So winning is clearly pie in the sky. But you could well cost the Tories a seat. And therefore they could well turn around at the next election, 2015, and say a vote for UKIP is a vote for a Labour government.
Well, I mean, 20 years ago, I got 952 votes, but UKIP was a very small party in those days. There is this simplistic idea that UKIP just takes votes off the Conservative Party. It does not.
That's always been his message, hasn't it? That he's not just a splinter of the Tories.
Yes, and to some extent he has been proven correct. I mean, I think even in the 2015 general election, to some extent, I mean, you had things like the UKIP vote in Ed Ball's seat. Basically, essentially, one can look at it as splitting the vote and allowing the Tories to take a seat that they almost certainly wouldn't have otherwise. And I think that's more relevant now today. I mean, in terms of my research for the book, The Rise of Reform, the thing that I came across a lot, particularly in the north of England, were how many people were either ex-Labour in terms of being activists or even councillors, or at the very least came from a Labour background. Their parents were probably, Labour activists, etc. So he is certainly attracting ex-Labour people now. That's for sure.
But his power base for many years, somewhat ironically given his attitude, was the European Parliament. He was more successful getting into the European Parliament than he was getting into the House of Parliament. Here's his maiden speech back in 1999, which took place after the EU had instituted a beef ban in the so-called mad cow disease.
Let me say right from the outset that the UK Independence Party, my party, totally deplore the outbreaks of petty nationalism in the UK and France over this beef issue. However, I find it ironic that the EU institutions have, by their original actions, created a political situation which has directly led to this disharmony. Now we have a classic demonstration that membership of the EU is bad for British business. It affirms my belief that it's about time that my own country recognise that our interests are best served by not being a member of this club.
I mean, that is something about him. He's a good, competent parliamentary performer, isn't he?
Yes, he is. When he tries, as he did in that maiden speech. I mean, one of the things that really helped Farage get into the European Parliament was obviously the adoption of a proportional representation system, a closed list. It used to be first past the post. It's actually a question of, had the UK not adopted a PR system for European elections, would Farage ever have become an MEP? And we'll never know for sure, but it's an interesting question for history.
And they currently, Reform UK, in his latest political manifestation, they are in favour of proportional representation.
I think they're still technically in favour of proportional representation. Of course, it becomes a lot harder to... Generally speaking, parties that would be helped by PR tend to like it, and those that would be hurt by it tend to not like it. And actually, there's an argument now that a PR system would, at least in theory, be bad for Reform, because they could technically be the largest party or even win a majority on a very slender percentage of the vote under first past the post. So I think technically they're still in favour of PR. I think de facto, I think that might be another matter.
One of his most famous battles to get to Westminster took place in 2005 in South Thanet. This time he came fourth, but then going on fighting the same seat in 2015, he gave it a go, and UKIP was riding high following the European parliamentary elections, taking on Craig McKinley in a very fiercely contested contest in which he ended up coming second.
Yeah. I said, as this campaign went on, that if I didn't win, I would stand down as leader of UKIP. And I know that you in the media are used to party leaders making endless promises that they don't actually keep, but I'm a man of my word. So I should be writing to the UKIP National Executive in a few minutes, saying that I am standing down as leader of UKIP, and there will be a leadership election for the next leader of UKIP in September, and I will consider, over the course of this summer, whether to put my name forward to do that job again.
He was very upset about that, wasn't he?
He was very upset. I mean, I think part of it was that he came so much closer than he ever had before. I mean, I don't think he'd ever finished second before. I could be wrong, but I feel pretty certain about that. He'd always finished sort of fourth or third, and he came within 2,000 votes or 2,500 votes of winning in 2015, and I think that probably irked him. I think it just naturally would have.
Because previously in 2010, he stood in the general election in Buckingham against the Speaker, which was kind of breaking with convention, knowing that he probably wouldn't win because the other parties tend to give the Speaker a bye. But on polling day, he boarded a two-seater aircraft, which then proceeded to crash after an election banner got caught up with it. A few years later, this is how he reflected on that crash.
I thought I'd liven up the general election of 2010 by, on the morning of election day, getting into a very small light aircraft and attempting to tow a banner around the Buckingham constituency saying, vote for your country, vote UKIP. Things went horrendously wrong. The banner got twisted around the tail of the aeroplane, and we inevitably were going to crash. And if before that crash in politics I was unafraid to take on the establishment, since that day I've been fearless.
He likes to talk about his near-death experiences, doesn't he?
Yes. I mean, sometimes with Farage, I'd say a negative of Farage is sometimes he can kind of want to play the victim a little bit. He can fall into that. I think it's one of his more negative tendencies, a sort of woe is me type of persona that he can delve into. I mean, having said that, in 2010, it was pretty horrific. I remember seeing the aftermath of the crash, and it was pretty bad. And again, to then turn around and say something positive about Farage, I mean, for him to have gone through that, I just feel like a lot of people would have walked away after that. I mean, he didn't even come second in a seat. He came third yet again, and then having that plane crash. I mean, actually to continue on, and actually in a sense the real Farage story almost begins in 2010. It almost begins after that, because that's when looking back on it, he really came to national prominence and came to really change the national debate.
And where he also established his power base before the base at Westminster was again the European Parliament with the Brexit Party.
Yes, absolutely. And, having the experience of knowing how those elections work and etc. would have held him in good stead for what happened with the Brexit Party, although there are whole other parts to that story, which I'm sure we'll come on to.
And here he is at the launch of Brexit.
You are here today at the birth, at the launch of a new force in British politics. Welcome to the Brexit Party. I haven't spent 25 years of my life fighting to raise the issue of why we should be an independent, normal, self-governing country, to simply roll over and to allow a career political class to betray that result without me fighting back. Well, the fight back begins here in Coventry today.
That was yet another comeback.
Yes, it was yet another comeback. And I think that's one of the things people like to write off Nigel Farage and say, well, he's not coming back from this, or this is the end. People said that in 2015. People said that sort of after Boris Johnson became Prime Minister. I remember there was a lot of kind of talk around, oh, well, that's the end of that. But actually, the launch of the Brexit Party, I spoke to many people in the research for the book about that particular thing. The sort of the confluence of events that launching the Brexit Party, standing in the 2019 European elections, which, to remember, it was very touch and go whether that would happen or not, because it was a matter of will Mrs. May get a withdrawal agreement in time, etc. And in the end, she didn't, and the elections went ahead. And of course, they won those elections fairly handily. I mean, mind you, the Lib Dems did pretty well as well. Reform essentially galvanised the pro-Brexit vote. Lib Dems galvanised the anti-Brexit vote. And actually, in the history of Farage, one of the interesting things about it is that was the sort of very first time I think that he could say the two-party system is imperiled. And because the Tories did extraordinarily bad in that election, from what I recall, I think they got 4 seats and about 8% of the vote.
Yeah, but then under Boris Johnson at the end of the year, they came back and
stormed back and won.
And did very well. I mean, there's a bit of a grudge between Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage, isn't there?
Yes. I mean, I think part of that goes between the sort of vote leave.eu rivalry that happened during the EU referendum campaign. So that's part of it. And then I feel like Farage still carries a lot of resentment towards what happened in 2019. So basically, the Brexit Party stood down against all the Tory candidates. They only stood in seats where the Tories didn't have an MP. And that undoubtedly helped Boris Johnson, helped the Tories get that thumping majority. And I think he feels that he had to do it for Brexit, but he still feels resentment about it, I think.
Then came the surprise in 2024, or was it a surprise, that he was actually going to run in Clacton? Certainly came as a surprise to the Reform UK candidate who thought he was going to run. Here's Nigel Farage.
So I have decided I've changed my mind. It's allowed, It's not always a sign of weakness. It could potentially be a sign of strength. So I am going to stand in this election. I'll be launching my candidacy at midday tomorrow in the Essex seaside town of Clacton.
Was it a surprise?
Behind the scenes, it had been kind of going on for a while. Although, having said that, I mean, the big thing that I heard from other people interviewing people for the book was that he had a kind of wobble after Sunak surprised everybody and called the election in May. And it was a sort of like, do we have enough time? Are we ready? And the story that's told to me by several people is that, he went out on the campaigning trail. He was in Lincolnshire. He was in Skegness, actually, specifically. And the reception was so good that he decided he has to get back into it. I suppose for balance, one has to wonder about how the 5 million quid Chris Horborn situation played into that. I suppose we don't know.
Having financial security.
Correct. How much that played into his ability to say, well, I will stand. I mean, we don't know. But I think actually Sunak and the people around him called the election slightly, I think to some level, to call Farage's bluff. I think they felt like he's in the midst of this, he'll want to go off to America, he'll want to be with Trump. If we call it now, Farage will just go, I don't have enough time, and go away. And so it was a gamble that didn't quite pay off as intended.
Now, having been elected in 2024, he faces investigation, of course, for a non-declaration of support he's received, including that 5 million, and he's gone and called a by-election in Clacton-on-Sea.
I've thought about it hard, and I've decided today I will resign as a Member of Parliament for Clacton-on-Sea, thereby forcing a by-election, which would happen, I hope, in short order. No, I've decided that the people of Clacton should be the judges of my actions. This will be a people versus the establishment by-election, and that is why I will be putting my name forward to stand in this by-election. I will fight to win. I will fight to continue the political revolution that reform has started.
I mean, this really is the most kind of, to use the word revolutionary, that he's just sort of a démarche he's attempted so far, isn't it?
I'd agree. And I guess there's conflicting reports about, did he go off in a fit of pique and just sort of do this without thinking about all the possible variables? Or did they war game this and it's fine and he doesn't actually mind going, running a by-election basically against Bin-Face, Piers Corbyn and Lawrence Fox? I have my doubts about that.
You think he didn't see that the other parties would drop out?
I think he probably needs a few more grown-ups in the room, someone who might say, do you know what do we do if this happens? I think they all felt like this is going to be great. It's going to be the showdown with the establishment that we want. I understand why they did it. I just don't think they thought about, well, what happens if all of the other parties stand aside? I don't think that was sufficiently war-gamed.
And what do you reckon to his electoral future?
So I reckon he will win Clacton fairly easily. I think sort of 60, maybe even 70% of the vote. I think that... And then we move on. So I don't think Clacton's actually going to tell us very much in the end. It will kind of be, oh, okay, well, he won. Well, of course he won. Having said that, there is this small, slender chance that he either loses or, if Bin-Face comes within 1,000 votes, that is an embarrassing situation for him.
Nick Tyrone, thank you very much indeed for taking us through Nigel Farage's electoral history here on Times Radio.